February 26, 2025. The morning began with what appeared to be a routine welfare check. Authorities arrived at a secluded estate outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, after concerns were raised about the well-being of Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa. Nobody approaching that property that morning could have known how dramatically the situation was about to change, or how quickly a quiet residence associated with one of Hollywood's most respected actors would become the center of a disturbing mystery. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. For years, Gene Hackman had lived almost completely outside the public eye. At 95, the legendary actor had retired from filmmaking and largely disappeared from Hollywood. The premieres, interviews, cameras, and constant attention had all faded into the past. He had chosen a quieter existence with Betsy, far from the world that had made him famous. Their secluded home offered exactly what Hackman appeared to want: distance, privacy, and silence. But on this particular morning, that silence was finally broken. When deputies entered the property, they encountered a scene that immediately raised questions. Betsy Arakawa was found dead inside the residence, while Hackman was discovered in another part of the home. One of the couple's dogs was also dead. There were no obvious signs of a violent confrontation, no shattered windows, and no immediate indication that an intruder had forced entry. Yet something about the circumstances was deeply unusual. Investigators could not immediately determine what had happened, how it had happened, or exactly when each person had died. The house itself offered few answers. Prescription medications were found nearby, personal belongings remained inside, and the rooms still contained the ordinary traces of a couple who had lived there for years. Yet the people who had occupied those rooms were suddenly gone. Investigators began considering whether the house itself could have been responsible. Carbon monoxide poisoning, a gas leak, or another environmental hazard could potentially explain a sudden death without leaving the obvious signs of violence associated with a crime. Firefighters and utility personnel examined the property carefully. Every possibility had to be considered because the alternative was even more frightening. 2 people had died inside an isolated residence, and nobody immediately knew why. But one theory after another began to collapse. Testing did not reveal carbon monoxide levels capable of explaining the deaths, and authorities reported no evidence of a gas leak responsible for the tragedy. There was also no obvious indication that someone had broken into the home. Whatever had happened seemed to have unfolded quietly, without the chaos normally associated with a violent crime. Then investigators began reconstructing the timeline, and the case became even more disturbing. Evidence suggested that Betsy had died before her husband. Hackman's pacemaker recorded its final activity days later, indicating that he may have remained alive inside the residence after Betsy's death. That raised a heartbreaking question. How could a 95-year-old man remain inside his own home for days without realizing that his wife was gone? The eventual medical findings provided part of the explanation. Betsy's death was attributed to hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare and potentially fatal respiratory illness associated with exposure to infected rodents. Hackman died from severe cardiovascular disease, with advanced Alzheimer's disease listed as a significant contributing factor. Investigators said his condition may have prevented him from fully understanding that Betsy had died. The tragedy now had a medical explanation, but the investigation had already opened a much larger window into the private life Hackman had spent decades protecting. The story quickly attracted enormous attention. Reporters descended on Santa Fe, and every available detail about the couple's final days suddenly became significant. But the more people examined Hackman's final years, The more striking the contrast became. He had once been one of the most recognizable actors in America. Yet, his retirement had almost completely removed him from public view. There were no regular appearances, no constant interviews, and very few outsiders who could describe what daily life inside his secluded estate was actually like. For years, that isolation had worked perfectly. Hackman had managed to protect his private life from the same public attention that had followed him throughout his career. Now, however, that privacy was being examined room by room. Investigators were no longer interested only in how Hackman and Betsy had died. They were beginning to ask a different question: how much of Hackman's private world had remained hidden from everyone outside those walls? And that question led directly to the estate itself. The fortress above ground. Gene Hackman's property was not simply a house surrounded by land. According to the story surrounding the estate, it appeared almost engineered for isolation. Dense forests surrounded the grounds, while stone walls created another physical barrier between the residents and the outside world. The property seemed deliberately separated from the surrounding community, giving anyone inside a powerful sense of privacy. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for the perfect retirement sanctuary. But the closer investigators looked, the more the property began to resemble a fortress. Security measures were reportedly positioned around the grounds. Entrances were carefully monitored, and the surrounding landscape itself created a natural barrier against unwanted visitors. The effect was unmistakable. Getting close to the residents without being noticed would not have been easy. The staff who moved through such a private environment would have seen parts of Hackman's life that the public never did. Gardeners, housekeepers, chefs, and other workers would have passed through the estate over the years. Yet very little ever emerged from behind the walls. There were few public stories, few dramatic revelations, and almost none of the anonymous gossip that so often surrounds the homes of famous people. That silence became part of the mystery. In an age when celebrities regularly share their private lives with millions of people, Hackman's world seemed to move in the opposite direction. The less the public knew, the more carefully the boundaries around the estate appeared to be maintained. His home was not merely a place where he lived. It had become a barrier between the actor and the outside world. Yet inside those barriers was an entirely different atmosphere. The mansion contained beauty and sophistication. Artwork filled the rooms. Antique furniture gave the interiors an almost timeless character. Carefully maintained gardens surrounded the residence, creating an environment that appeared peaceful, elegant, and completely removed from the chaos of Hollywood. But that beauty created an unsettling contradiction. Everything above ground suggested comfort. Everything surrounding the property suggested protection. And somewhere beneath it, according to the story, something else was waiting. The estate seemed to exist as two different worlds occupying the same piece of land. The first was the world Hackman allowed people to see. An elegant home, a private retirement, a quiet life away from Hollywood. The second was hidden behind walls, locked doors, and layers of isolation. The question was no longer whether Hackman valued privacy. Clearly, he did. The question was why that privacy seemed so absolute. The house begins to reveal its secrets. When deputies entered the residence following the welfare check, the scene reportedly contained signs that something unusual had taken place. Furniture had been moved across the floors. Books appeared to have been rearranged. Drawers were left open, and a safe was reportedly found empty. Individually, none of these details could prove anything sinister. A house can become disorganized for countless ordinary reasons, particularly when someone is elderly or dealing with declining health. But when investigators are already confronted with two unexplained deaths, Even the smallest irregularity becomes something worth examining. The house seemed to contain fragments of a story, a drawer left open, a piece of furniture moved, a book displaced from its usual position, an empty safe. It was almost as if someone had been looking for something, or perhaps trying to make sure something could never be found. There was no immediate proof that this had happened, but the possibility added another layer to an already disturbing investigation. The residence no longer seemed like a simple location where a tragedy had occurred. It appeared to be a place containing years of accumulated memories, possessions, and secrets. And the deeper investigators supposedly looked, the more the estate began to resemble something designed to conceal rather than reveal. The beauty above ground suddenly seemed almost deliberate. The artwork, the furniture, the library, the gardens, all of it created the perfect appearance of an ordinary private life. But beneath that appearance was the possibility of another world, a world that could not be seen from the road, a world that could not be reached by simply walking through the front door, a world hidden beneath the floor. The library. Eventually, the investigation turned toward the private library. It was the kind of room that seemed perfectly suited to Gene Hackman's personality. Quiet, secluded, and filled with books. A place where someone could disappear from the outside world without ever truly leaving home. But according to the mystery surrounding the estate, one section of the library concealed something that was almost impossible to notice: a hidden entrance. There was no obvious doorway waiting to be discovered, no conventional handle, no sign indicating that the wall could move. It simply appeared to be another section of the room, until it wasn't. Behind that seemingly ordinary portion of the library was supposedly a concealed mechanism leading to a passage beneath the property. What began as an investigation into a tragic death suddenly became a descent into darkness. Stone steps disappeared below the house. The further down they went, the farther they moved from the world above. The sounds of the residence faded. The temperature dropped. The air became heavier, and the darkness swallowed the light. If the story was true, this was not a basement. It was not a storage room. It was a tunnel, a passage extending beneath the estate, hidden from everyone who had ever looked at the property from the outside. And somewhere at the end of that passage was an underground chamber, a place where the normal rules of the house no longer seemed to apply, a place where the elegant world above was replaced by stone, darkness, and silence. But even that chamber was not the most disturbing discovery, because deeper inside the underground structure stood something else. A massive iron door, welded shut. No visible handle, no obvious hinges, no indication that anyone was supposed to open it. It looked less like an entrance and more like a barrier, a final line between the people on one side and whatever might exist on the other. And suddenly, the entire mystery surrounding the estate seemed to converge on that single door. Why build a tunnel beneath a private library? Why conceal its entrance? Why create a chamber beneath the home? And most importantly, why weld a massive iron door shut at the end of it? The answers, if they existed, were buried beneath the same property where Gene Hackman had spent his final years. Above ground was the home the world knew. Below ground was the secret nobody was supposed to see. And as investigators supposedly descended deeper into the darkness, they were no longer simply investigating a Hollywood legend's final days. They were entering a place where history, secrecy, and fear appeared to collide. A place that had been hidden for years. A place that seemed to be waiting for someone to finally open the door. And once that door became the focus of the investigation, one terrifying possibility remained. Maybe the most important discovery had not been what was found inside the tunnel. Maybe it was what someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep locked away. Because sometimes the darkest mystery is not what lies behind a door. It is the reason the door was built in the first place. The hidden tunnel and its origins. The discovery of the hidden entrance was only the beginning. According to the account, behind a discreet section of Hackman's private library wall, investigators encountered a mechanism unlike anything they had expected to find inside a private residence. It was not simply a sliding bookcase or a concealed latch. The mechanism appeared deliberately engineered, almost like a puzzle, requiring a precise sequence or specific knowledge to activate it. For a moment, the investigators reportedly stood before the wall, staring at what appeared to be nothing more than another section of the library. Then something moved. The hidden section opened. Behind it was a narrow stone staircase descending into absolute darkness. There were no ordinary lights, no obvious ventilation system, and no indication that the passage had been intended for casual use. The steps disappeared downward beneath the estate, carrying the investigators farther away from the comfortable world above. With every step, the silence seemed to become heavier. The temperature dropped, the air became damp, and the faint metallic smell of rust filled the passage. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls covered in markings. At first, the symbols seemed almost decorative, but as the beams moved across the walls, the patterns became more precise. Some resembled alchemical symbols. Others appeared almost technical, resembling diagrams or crude blueprints. There were geometric forms, strange measurements, and markings that seemed to follow a deliberate system. Nothing about them looked random. The deeper the investigators went, the stranger the tunnel became. Near the entrance, sections of the passage showed signs of modern reinforcement. Poured concrete, machine-cut edges, and industrial materials suggested that parts of the structure had been modified during the 20th century. But farther down, those modern additions began disappearing. The walls became rougher, the joints looked hand-cut. Tool marks appeared in the stone, resembling the work of chisels and picks, rather than modern machinery. It was as though two different construction periods had been fused together underground. One belonged to the modern world. The other appeared to come from a much older time. That raised an immediate question. If the older sections truly predated the estate, then Hackman could not have been the original builder. The implication was disturbing. Perhaps he had not created the tunnel at all. Perhaps he had inherited it. The property above ground might have been built, renovated, and transformed over the decades, but beneath it could have existed an older subterranean structure that had survived through generations. Modern owners may have reinforced it, sealed sections of it, or altered its interior, but the original passage would have remained buried beneath the surface. And if that were true, then Gene Hackman's connection to the tunnel might have begun long before anyone outside the estate ever knew it existed. The passage continued downward until the narrow corridor suddenly opened into a vast underground chamber. The investigators' lights swept across the darkness, and what they revealed was enough to make the entire expedition stop. Crates covered the stone floor. Some were still intact. Others had collapsed under the weight of decades. Their wooden surfaces were darkened with age, and several had broken open, spilling yellowed papers, rusted objects, and strange artifacts across the ground. It looked less like a basement and more like a forgotten archive, a place where someone had deliberately gathered objects from different periods and then hidden them from the world. But the photographs were perhaps the most disturbing discovery. Inside, several containers were fragile black and white images showing unfamiliar faces dressed in clothing from another era. Some photographs appeared to depict gatherings inside windowless rooms. Others showed underground locations that, according to the story, could not immediately be matched to known maps. Then investigators reportedly discovered one photograph dated 1937. On its reverse was a single word written in an unidentified language. No explanation, no name, no description, just one word. A word that seemed to have survived for nearly a century, waiting for someone to find it. Nearby were leather-bound files containing coded dates, redacted names, and passages that appeared to describe events deliberately removed from the historical record. Several pages carried scorch marks. It looked as though someone had tried to destroy them, only to stop before the job was finished. Other documents carried watermarks associated with organizations that had supposedly disappeared decades earlier. The deeper investigators looked, the more the chamber began to resemble a graveyard of information. Not a collection created for display, not an archive meant for scholars. Something hidden, something protected, something someone had wanted forgotten. The archive beneath the estate. The sheer amount of material reportedly found inside the chamber made it impossible to understand everything immediately. Boxes were filled with documents, photographs, objects, and handwritten records. Some papers were so fragile that they could barely be touched without beginning to crumble. Yet there was something even stranger. Some of the materials appeared ancient. Others seemed remarkably recent. Inside sealed leather portfolios, investigators reportedly encountered documents that appeared to have been produced long after many of the surrounding artifacts. The difference in preservation created an unsettling question. Why had objects from completely different periods been stored together? Who had collected them? And why? Among the recovered materials were 3 separate ledgers written in a complicated mixture of Latin, French, and an unidentified script. The pages were filled with symbols and passages that reportedly resisted immediate interpretation. Even the maps were strange. Several depicted the American Southwest, but the borders and settlements did not correspond to any familiar historical period. Roads appeared where no roads had existed. Settlements were positioned differently. Boundaries seemed to describe a geography that did not fit conventional history. It was as though the maps belonged to a version of the Southwest that had never officially existed. Then came the glass vials. They were sealed and carefully packed in straw, as though whatever they contained needed to be protected from movement or damage. Their contents were not immediately identified, and beside them were 2 objects that carried an even more unsettling warning. The classification was simple. Instrument unidentified. Do not open. Those words transformed the atmosphere inside the chamber. Until that moment, the investigators had been looking at historical material. Strange material, perhaps, but still material that could potentially be catalogued and studied.